Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here, and welcome to my review of the Hifiman HE400se, which is Hifiman's entry-level planar magnetic headphone that has come out recently. And in this review, I want to share my thoughts and opinions on what this looks and sounds like. And of course, I think what's important to talk about in this case is how this sounds driven off different source gear. So I've driven this off an Apple dongle off my iFi Diablo, which I've bought recently, which I like a lot. Um, my Q-Style M15 dongle, and last but not the least, Hifiman's own amp, the EF400, which is an amazing amp, and I'll discuss this. It's a DAC and an amp. So that's it for the structure. Now to jump right in. So in terms of aesthetics, build, and comfort, although this looks like some other Hifiman headphones that have this one headband round circumaural style, I still feel like this is slightly better constructed for some reason, and this could well be because how well or how nicely finished the silver aesthetic looks. Because the silver aesthetic is glossy, but it's not too glossy, and it's very well done. It actually feels somewhat premium for the price, honestly, somewhat premium for the $150 price tag. Like if you gave me this aesthetic and design and construction for a $6,000 headphone, I'd have massive issues with you. But for $150, I feel like this is a home run. There are no creaky parts. This feels very sturdy in the hands, and honestly, for $150, I feel like this is pretty well designed, well constructed, nicely built, with good comfort. Some people complain about the hotspot you get with this one headband style system. Like this is the sort of system that you get with the Focal Utopia, for example, or a Focal Clear, with a slightly more clamp, I think, than a Utopia. But it's not too clampy, and I haven't had any hotspots. And I feel like the pads are very comfortable. And overall, for aesthetics, build, and comfort, I mean, I'll keep this brief because I don't think there's anything offensive going on here, but I think overall it's pretty decent. So kudos Hifiman. And if you have worries about Hifiman QC, like I've talked about in the past, I think the customer service is great. So you might want to get this on warranty. Now, what this sounds like is pretty interesting because so it does graph like a lot of other Hifiman headphones does in terms of its frequency response. So there is a bit of a sub-bass roll-off. There are other headphones from Hifiman that have a better extended sub-bass. But I don't hear the sub-bass roll-off at all, honestly. You do sense a 7K peak, and I do sense this, and some reviewers have picked up on it and talked about it. So the treble to me was not the smoothest, but it wasn't bad. Mid-range is pretty standard Hifiman affair. You have a pinna gain, and then you have a 2K dip before the pinna gain, and then a slight sort of energy peak around 1K, which can introduce a sense of honkiness. But overall, the tonality, I think, is fairly decent. The one thing I do want to say, and this is coming from someone who is not very treble sensitive, like if you've seen my Hifiman Aria Stealth review, I haven't talked about, like I don't get bothered by the Hifiman Aria treble, which is a headphone that some people have called bright and sharp. This to me though can be a bit sharp of tracks that are not well recorded. So this is, to my mind, overall for the price, an amazing headphone. I'll get into why. It's not so much because of tonality, because Hifiman gets its tonality right for most headphones, and Hifiman got its tonality right for this amp. I mean, this DAC amp sounds better than a lot of $2,000 DAC amps, honestly. I kid you not. Like, this will get its review. And yeah, I can't wait to review this. But honestly, guys, like, this headphone is a bit sharp sounding, is basically what I'm getting at. So it does matter what you drive this with, which will be the last part of this discussion. Overall tonality, I find it to be analytical and slightly on the sharper side of most gears that I've driven it with, but not all. Some gears have done a great job in synergizing with it, and we'll talk about that. Now, to talk about technical performance, and by that we talk about how, subjectively it, sounds in terms of the information it's able to retrieve from tracks, its soundstage width and depth, its imaging, and finally its timbre, and of course its speed and dynamics. So in terms of resolution, for $150, I feel like Hifiman essentially got one of their high-end headphones and just held back a bit of resolution, because it's not night and day from other Hifiman headphones. It's, of course, you'll notice that it's not doesn't have the same level of clarity and some same level of like resolution in the tracks. So a lot of things like background information is not as clearly depicted. But I can live with this. In terms of resolution, if this was my first headphone, I'd be pretty happy, guys. And for $150, I feel like it's a definite home run. Soundstage-wise, again, it's a pretty standard open back, high-end headphone-like soundstage. There's nothing wrong with the soundstage. It is not wide, like how. And again, I do think we exaggerate when we talk about soundstage width of a headphone. Like, yeah, the HE400se is wide, but like I've talked about before, it's not speaker wide, right? It's not like an out of the head, out of the body experience or whatever. But it's a wide sounding stage for an open back headphone. So this is pretty standard width. I don't think anyone is going to have issues with the soundstage width. Its soundstage depth is not as world class as a Utopia, but it's fairly layered, and the layering does depend on what you drive it with, rather what it's being driven from. And I'll get into that because I've heard this headphone scale in terms of its layering, especially depending on what I've driven it with. Imaging, I think, is masterclass, and imaging is one of the reasons why I've called this headphone spectacular, because its imaging, I feel like it is almost at the same level as like really high-end Hifiman headphones. Not completely, but it's not really far off. So I was listening to this with my eyes closed, and you get that sort of images darting around, and you're able to sort of think about, okay, so this is coming from this direction, and oh wow, so this came from that direction. So that stuff happens with this headphone. So it's pretty clear imaging, well separated. So very impressive for $150. Speed and dynamics wise, it's not going to win any prizes, but it's fairly fast and fairly punchy, and the punch does depend on what headphone you drive it with, but I've not sensed a lack of punch with this. I've not sensed an issue listening to headphone tracks and songs from heavy metal or rock or even hip hop artists. I feel like this can be an all-rounder headphone for all genres. And finally, timbre-wise, it does have a bit of a planar timbre, so it's pretty snappy and perhaps a slight tendency towards plasticness. It is not the most natural sounding headphone, but that is not something you expect when you get into an entry-level planar like this. Overall, technically, I feel like for the price, you get a powerhouse. So if I were to compare how this sounds technically with regard to this, the HD6XX, if you're driving all these or both these headphones off like regular DAC and amps, and if you don't have an OTL at your disposal, you should get this, because this will resolve more. This has a wider stage, and overall I feel like this is a more high-end experience than the 6XX, only when you're driving it off a normal DAC amp or a dongle, whatever. However, if you drive this off an OTL, that's a different story. Then this blows this out of the water and then some. This off an OTL is like a $1,500 headphone, I think, and in that case this is like not even in the same league as 6XX. However, like I said, if you're driving both off, let's say, for example, this, a Q-Style M15, I feel like this holds its own. Now, so you get a sense of what this sounds like. I do want to talk about what this sounds like of different source gears, starting with the Apple dongle, because this is a pretty entry-level headphone, so some of you might wonder whether an Apple dongle can drive this. The answer is yes, it can, but it sounds weak. It sounds very timid. It doesn't sound very, as big as it can. So I feel like the sound stage, overall presentation gets squished a bit, and it becomes a bit dry sounding, and this whole dry the treble becomes a bit more acerbic, a bit more, the 7K peak becomes a bit more evident and all that. So I don't honestly recommend driving this with a dongle. You move on to something higher end like a Q-Style M15. So this is a pretty neutral sounding device, and this I've often felt this on the brighter side perhaps, but with this and this combination, it sounded pretty great. I didn't feel the brightness wasn't very evident to me. And so overall, I feel like this was a pretty nice pairing. I was able to listen to this pairing for a long period of time. So this is, like I said, the M15 dongle. I'm not taking the dongle out right now. Off the iFi Diablo, which has a Burr Brown DAC chip, and this worked really well with my Susvara and the Abyss 1266 5TC, and I'll talk about that in a different review or a separate review of this portable DAC amp. But however, off my Diablo, and the Diablo is slightly more neutral sounding than a lot of other iFi products. It doesn't have the same warm thickness that I feel like the iFi Signature did. So of the Diablo, this again sounded a bit bright and fatiguing, honestly, because the Diablo can have a very forward presentation, and that didn't jive very well with the 400se. However, finally, off Hifiman's own DAC amp, this is the EF400, which I was listening to about half an hour ago. With this DAC amp, honestly, guys, and I have no reason to, hype this up, but of this DAC amp, the HE400se sounded magnificent. Like, to the point that its tonality became the perfect blend between being thick and not overly thick. It became very lucid, very musical, and the resolution increased, and layering noticeably got better. So I don't know what magic Hifiman has done with the EF400. So I know this is not an EF400 review, that will get its own review. But that's a phenomenal product, and I feel like this has been tuned with Hifiman headphones in mind, because that R2R thickness you get with their Himalaya DAC technology or whatever they have going on inside that DAC amp is just perfect for a lot of Hifiman headphones, because a lot of Hifiman headphones can sound slightly thinner. So this of that is perfect sounding, like a no-brainer recommendation. Get this if you have that, or if you want to get that, get this. But of course, that is 4 times the price of this, so that might not make sense to a lot of you. So the minimum I recommend to drive this is a M15, because M15 pairs well with this, guys. That said, this can be slightly peaky, so keep that in mind. The last and very critical disclaimer is that this hasn't been broken in completely. So I got this in recently, and I've had, in my experience with break-in, certain things do sound less bright and shouty. So I do want to give this a bit of time, which is the reason why. Bear with me if I do another review of the HE400se, and if I happen to find that this has broken in, has become slightly more mellower sounding. It's not necessarily aggressive or very sharp, but it can be peaky. So that's it, guys. That's my review for the HE400se, and if you want to talk about it further, of course, you can engage me in the comments of this video, or directly by messaging me on Headphone or on my email. And I hope this review was useful. I'll see you in my next one. Bye-bye.